So thank you everyone for coming. Today we're going to talk about the menu widget. It's a family of widgets that actually use the container package that's available. And menu offers you 3 different menus, widgets to take advantage of. Those are the menu base class, the menu bar class, and the context menu class. And so using menu, just as a quick kind of overview, you can build things like navigation, left navigation for websites. So this screenshot shows the left-hand nav of a basic HTML page with flyout menus cascading out from that navigation. You can also build top-down flyout navigation as demonstrated in this example. You can even go so far as to mimic the desktop. So this example shows how you can build something like the Windows Start menu using menu. You can also build application-style menu bars, so something you might be familiar with on Mac OS X or the menu bar from any application window. And lastly, context menus. So this is a screen capture of the new Yahoo Mail beta, showing that I've invoked a context menu on one of the messages. And there are plenty of, I think there's 20-some menu examples available on developer.yahoo.com/YUI/examples/menu. So feel free to check those out. The menu library has several dependencies, and those are the Yahoo object, the DOM utility, the event utility, the container core library, which includes the module and overlay classes, and finally, the menu library. And for more info on each of those components that are a requirement, feel free to just read up on those at developer.yahoo.com/YUI. Some of the key features for menu are built-in iframe shim for IE less than 7. If you're not already aware, IE has had a bug for a long time where select elements poke through other z-index elements on the page. So essentially selects always have the highest z-index, and there was no way of stopping that. But we figured out that if you position an iframe as a shim between that div that's positioned and the select elements below it, it will stop the select from poking through, essentially fixing that bug. Menu also gives you browser viewport boundary positioning. This is something that is actually a feature implemented in the overlay class that is one of the base classes for menu. This essentially allows you to make sure that your menu always resides within the confines of the viewport. Menu also has a set of accessibility features that are very useful. One is that it can support screen readers. So those users are able to still interact with the menu. And also, menu gives you the opportunity to interact with it using both the mouse and keyboard. Another feature of menu is that it's designed to support progressive enhancement, meaning that menu's markup is at its very core based on a set of unordered lists, so that the hierarchy of the menu data is conveyed regardless of whether JavaScript or CSS are enabled in the browser, so that users of really old browsers, such as Netscape 3 or 4, still have access to the content of the menu, and the menu content is still conveyed in a meaningful way, which essentially provides a semantically sound DOM structure, which is that final bullet point on this slide. So here's a screen capture quickly demonstrating that nasty bug in IE, how the select menu is poking through the cascading menu hierarchy. And here's just a brief overview of the YUI menu object model. There is a base class called menu module, and from that are 2 subclasses, menu and menu bar, and then finally context menu, which is a subclass of menu. The object model for menu looks like this. There you have the menu class, which essentially has menu item instances inside of it. And this object model can be nested inside itself n number of times. So essentially, menu instances are always children of their parent menu items. And just to give you some insight into how this object model translates back into markup, this transition demonstrates that. So at its core, menu is a container which is represented with these two divs wrapping an unordered list. A little bit about the core API for menu. So the menu constructor follows that of its base classes, module and overlay. So the first argument is always the element ID, and this can either be the ID of an existing element on the page or the ID of an element that you want to create. So if you're building your menu hierarchy completely from JavaScript, passing in the ID of an element to that constructor, that menu will then be created for you and put into the DOM. The second argument, which is optional, is an object literal that represents a set of configuration properties for your menu. Essentially, do you want your menu to be visible or hidden by default? Do you want it to have a default height and width, etc.? Some key menu configuration properties are the z-index configuration property, which essentially controls how that menu is layered on the screen with respect to other positioned elements. Again, the iframe configuration property, which toggles the iframe shim. That property is set to true by default for IE less than 7, since that bug was fixed in IE 7, and it's false for every other browser. The constraint to viewport configuration property, setting that to true, which is the default, will assure that the menu always remains inside the confines of the viewport, which can be incredibly useful if you've got a very large menu hierarchy and the user is mousing through it and their submenus are getting close to the edge of the viewport. The submenus will automatically redirect themselves in the other direction to remain inside the boundary to ensure that the content is still available to the user. And a position configuration property, which essentially allows you to determine if that menu should be positioned in line with other content on the page, or if that menu should be floating on top of other content on the page. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Some key menu properties. The parent property will always return you a reference to the menu's parent object. So in the case of a submenu, that's going to give you the menu's parent menu item instance. In the case of a menu item, that'll be the parent menu. The element property returns you a reference to the root DOM element for your menu. So in the case of menu, that's always going to be a div. And the ID is essentially the ID of the root DOM element. Some key menu methods. Add item will essentially allow you to add an item to your menu. Get item will allow you to retrieve an item from your menu, and get item just takes an integer representing the position of that menu, so 0 through X. Insert item allows you to essentially insert an item into an existing menu. Remove item will allow you to remove a menu item from a menu, and you can either pass the ordinal position of the menu item you want removed to remove item, or you can pass a menu item reference to remove item and have that removed. Show and hide, pretty straightforward. We'll just make it, we'll toggle the visibility property of your menu between hidden and visible. And finally, the render method will allow you to render your menu into the document. Some key menu item properties. Element and parent are essentially the same as they are for menu. Element returning you the root DOM node for your menu item, in this case, is always an LI element. The parent always being a menu instance. The index property gives you that menu item's index in its parent menu. And the value property is just useful for storing arbitrary data for that menu item that you might need to do something with on click or on mouse over. Some key menu item methods are focus and blur. Essentially allows you to give keyboard focus to an item, so that if you want to, for example, show a menu and then bring focus to a given element by default, so the user can take immediate keyboard action on that. Those two methods allow you to control what element has focus. menu item also has some useful configuration properties. Those are on the left, and as I go through them, I'll try to point them out, how they relate to the visual on the right-hand side. So the text property is obviously the text label of the menu item. The help text configuration property allows you to define some helper text that typically goes along with that text label. Most often that's some sort of keyboard shortcut that you want to expose to the user. But it might also be used for something else, like if you have a cascading menu hierarchy for a website and, for example, one of the items in that menu represents a new feature for a product or something like that. You might want to put the words new next to it, or with a starburst graphic or something like that to indicate that that item is a new item. The disabled configuration property essentially dims the menu item, alerting the user that that item will no longer respond to events and essentially is not able to be interacted with. So it won't respond to clicks, mouse overs at all. Selected essentially highlights the menu item. And finally, the checked configuration property allows you to render that menu item with a check mark. So if you're using that menu item to store a preference, you can echo that back to the user in the form of a check mark. And for more information on any of the configuration properties, key methods, or regular properties, they're all available to you online at developer.yahoo.com/YUI/menu. So let's talk a little bit more about building menus. To build a menu from existing markup, you just start with the markup structure as indicated here. Again, you have a div wrapping an unordered list, and then you just call the menu constructor, passing in the ID of that div and then calling the render method. And if you're building your menu from existing markup on the page, you don't need to call render with any arguments. It essentially assumes that that menu is going to be rendered in place. And if you want to create a menu hierarchy, essentially to add submenus to your individual menu items, all you need to do is nest that structure inside of itself. So essentially the submenu div is a child node of the menu items li, and you can nest this n number of items deep. And the nice thing about this markup structure is that when you call the constructor for menu, you only need to initialize the root node. It will automatically crawl through all the child nodes and initialize and render all the submenus for you. So essentially you can build a pretty complex menu hierarchy in your markup and then initialize it in just 2 lines of JavaScript, calling the constructor and then calling the render method. So the benefits of this approach are, I think, 2. One, again, is this notion of progressive enhancement, that the menu content will be available to all browsers, from the most basic, such as links, text-only browser, to all the sophisticated browsers that we consider A-grade today, such as IE, Firefox, Safari, Opera. And also that second point of this notion of having all your submenus automatically initialized for you is a nice convenience. So a little bit more about progressive enhancement. This is just a demo that I like to demonstrate, that I put together just to demonstrate how you can build a website that functions from the lowest common denominator, such something like, again, a text-only browser like Links, to something like IE7. So in each example, the same exact markup structure is running in the browser. It's just the browser will render that markup differently depending on its capabilities with respect to CSS and JavaScript. So again, here we are in Links, text-only browser. So we've got no JavaScript support and no CSS support. But as you can see, because we've defined our menu using the unordered list, the hierarchy of the menu and the submenus the root and all the submenus are perfectly conveyed, even in a text-only browser. The next step up might be something like Netscape 4, which is a graphical browser, but considering its age, it has limited support for CSS and JavaScript. So we consider this a C-grade browser. We withhold that script and CSS from it, but again, the content is still available. Then you have a browser like Firefox, which has great support for CSS and JavaScript, but perhaps a user is paranoid, so they disable JavaScript. Again, the content is still available. And lastly, in Internet Explorer, where both CSS and JavaScript are enabled. In this example, this movie shows how that same markup that we demonstrated in each of those browsers previously is now running inside IE, and it's essentially mimicking the Windows start bar. So from lowest to highest common denominator, the menu kind of perfectly progressively enhances along the way. So we've covered building menus from existing HTML. You can also build menus with no existing HTML, so completely out of JavaScript. And to do that, you would call the menu constructor, passing in the ID of the element that you want to create. And then you would call the add item method, passing in the text label of your item or a menu item instance. And lastly, you would call the render method, passing in now a reference to the DOM element that this menu should be rendered into. So essentially calling render with a node reference will append your menu as a child node of that DOM element. This slide just demonstrates how you can call add item passing in a menu item reference. So on line 2 here, we're calling new yahoo.widget.menu item, passing in the text label as the first argument, and we're going to render this as disabled by default, so we're going to pass in an object literal of configuration properties that set that to disabled. Then we'll add that instance to the menu via add item, and then call render. And you can also build submenus via JavaScript. So in this case, we'll initialize 2 menus up front, one that will be the root and one that will be the submenu. And then we'll make that second menu a child of the menu item from the first menu by essentially passing it as the submenu configuration property to the menu item that we create. And then we add that item to the root menu and then call render. Another thing you could do would be to, if you have an existing submenu that you want to make the submenu of another menu item element, you could get a reference to that menu item, and using the configuration properties, configuration objects set property method, set the submenu to be the submenu of that menu item by passing that in as a reference to set property. So the benefits to building menus from JavaScript are that you can build them completely on the fly in response to events that might happen on the page. So the user clicks on some element, and that element generates a cascading menu that user can respond to choices on, for example. It also means that you can have a smaller initial page weight. If the menu doesn't represent some sort of core functionality to the page, but is more of tertiary navigation or something that happens in response to an option, there's no reason to deliver that HTML all up front if it's not necessary at the forefront of when the page loads. So you can essentially build it as needed, especially in response to XML HTTP requests. And another thing is if your application is built completely in JavaScript, this would be the way to go for you. So an example of that would be like the new Yahoo Mail beta is completely built using JavaScript. There's no pre-existing markup. So if your application is designed in that way, this is designed to support both models. A little bit about menu positioning. I mentioned earlier that there are 2 types. The 2 values that you can pass to the configuration property, the position configuration property for menu, are static and dynamic. Here is a little demonstration of that. Typically, menus are cascading off of some statically positioned root. So in this example, we have a statically positioned menu bar that has dynamically positioned cascading submenus that are a child of it. So in that case, the menu bar is static, and that is, menu bars are static by default, although you can set them to be positioned dynamically if you want. Whereas the menu and context menu classes have dynamic positioning by default. So essentially, they will always overlay on the screen. A little bit about the context menu class. Context menu inherits from yahoo.widget.menu. You instantiate it by just calling new yahoo.widget.context menu. It also adds two important configuration properties, and those are a trigger configuration property, which allows you to define what DOM elements trigger the display of this context menu. So essentially, when I initiate a context menu event against any DOM element, that will trigger the display of my context menu. It also adds a context event target property, which essentially will return you the DOM element on the page that was the original target of that context menu event. And this is useful if you, for example, have defined the trigger for your context menu to be an HTML table, which has a fairly complex DOM. So you've got lots of child nodes. Initiating a context menu on any one of those child nodes will essentially trigger the display of your context menu. But if you want to get at exactly which node was it, the TR, the TD, etc., that will allow you to do so. A little bit more about trigger. Again, the trigger configuration property are the elements to which the context menu instance belongs. And you can set the trigger to be any of the following: an element ID, an element reference, or an array of either. And to use context menu, the constructor is in the exact same format as menu and menu bar. So you will say new yahoo.widget.context menu, passing in the ID of the element that you want to create. You'll pass in also the trigger element. You'll add some items to your context menu via the add item method. And finally, you'll call render, passing in a reference to the element that you want your context menu to be rendered into. The final widget in the menu family that I wanted to talk about today is the menu bar. And menu bar is a statically positioned horizontal set of items that typically has submenus cascading off of it. The two classes that you'll use when you're working with menu bar are menu bar and menu bar item. Again, it's statically positioned by default, and it's typically the anchor for yahoo.widget.menu instances. And here's a screen capture of that quickly. The markup structure for menu bar is exactly the same as menu. So you have a div wrapping a set of unordered list elements. And to instantiate it, again, you will just call new yahoo.widget.menu bar, passing in the ID of the element that exists in the page and calling render, again, with no arguments since it already is in the DOM. And you can also build menu bars from JavaScript, just like you can menus. So in that case, you would call new yahoo.widget.menu bar, passing in the ID of the menu bar that will be created for you. You'll call add item, passing in the items for that menu bar, and then call render with the reference to the node that menu bar should be rendered into. To customize menu, you have two opportunities. One is CSS to style the menu, and you can also add event handlers to customize the behavior of your menu. All events that are exposed by the menu API are instances of the custom of yahoo.util.custom event. And that means that in order to listen for changes changes to when events fire, you'll listen to them by adding your callback via the subscribe method. And here's an example of what that looks like. So if we want to add a click event handler to our menu, you'll say, your instance.clickEvent.subscribe. The first argument is your event handler to be called. The second and third arguments are both optional. The second argument is an arbitrary object that you want passed back to your handler. And that can be any value, a string, an array, an object literal, whatever you need inside the scope of your event handler. And then the third and final argument is a scope correction argument, and that is a Boolean. And if you pass true, what that means is the second argument will now be, it'll change the scope of your this to be whatever object it is that you passed in as that second argument. So in this case, I've passed my menu to subscribe, meaning that my this inside the scope of my click event handler will refer to my menu instance. The benefit to using these custom events as opposed to just straight up DOM events are that you have a guaranteed execution order, and also that the scope of your event handler is able to be your menu or your menu item instances as you need it. And for more information on the custom events and our event utility in general, you can go to developer.yahoo.com/YUI/event. Some of the key events that you might find useful in menu is you have a before render and render event. You have a before show, and a before hide, and a hide. And that is it for menu. Thank you.